is often put out there that suffering is bad. And it's just something where when you actually think about it, suffering is not bad in of itself. And the understanding that most people come to is that they don't want to suffer, but that's not really a good way of looking at what suffering is. And to better understand why suffering is valuable and why it's important, you have to ask the question of absence of suffering. As in, if you cannot suffer, what would the world be like? Now, just think about it like this. It's not the same thing as saying that there's nothing that causes you to suffer. As, for example, you live a relatively benign life where all your needs are kind of met to an extent, so forth. You can say there's boringness or whatnot, but that is very different from the inability to suffer. So when we talk about the value of suffering, it's more about the capacity to suffer, not necessarily suffering itself. As I will say, it's you don't want to suffer, but you want to suffer. And to better understand that, I have to give, once again, a story-esque explanation. And this is a very simple one. Imagine yourself and you have a loved one, and that loved one dies, and you cannot suffer. Thus, their death means nothing to you. You go on about your day as if it didn't even happen. Here's the question I pose then. Did you ever truly love them? And that's the thing. Your reaction or your lack of suffering is not the idea that you aren't suffering. It's the idea that you never loved them in the first place. It shows you that not suffering is no different than not loving. So without suffering, you cannot love. And this is an important thing, when it comes to duality schools and everything else. A lot of people, when they get tripped up in this, they'll, pair off one thing or say the opposite of love is hate or something like that. And I think of the terms of opposites, not couplets or pairs. And the thing is day the opposite of night? That's what people think. Not that day and night are paired together. One gives the other meaning. Does hate give love meaning? No, it's not really even an opposite. That's why when it comes to this, the pair of love is suffering. Because without suffering, love has no meaning. And without love, suffering has no meaning. Imagine just getting shot by a bullet. And you just sit there and well, since you don't love yourself, you don't really care. The pain doesn't matter. And you just go on about your day as if, it never happened in the first place. The capacity to suffer is important. You want to be able to suffer. So when a loved one dies, that you suffer, it causes you pain. You ache and yearn for them. However, that does not mean you want your loved one to die. You don't want the suffering to happen, but you want the capacity to suffer. Because without it, you cannot love. You don't have the capacity to love. And that's why suffering is important. That's why suffering has value. It gives love meaning.